All right. Talking in Matthew 23 and spent some time here about these woes and talk some about vows, and as we move into this hypocritical side of this and these woes, Jesus here, it's kind of, well, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later in the chapter, but this idea of hypocrisy, right, of not being clean on the inside, not worrying more about the external than the internal. You know, I think in our lives, that's always a hard thing. For me, it is. You know, control our thoughts, control our emotions, control what we think, what we dwell upon. You know, it's easier for me to control the outside of me than the inside of me. I mean, I'll just be honest about it. A lot easier for me to do that. It's a lot easier for me to control what's on the outside than control the thoughts on the inside. And, you know, things I've struggled with over the years personally, anger issues I've struggled with, other things, you know, that always flares up inside of me first. You know, I get mad in my mind first before my body gets mad. You know, and sometimes I can keep my body from following that. Sometimes I can keep from saying something or keep from doing something, but you know, I still have those thoughts and I still have those things inside my head. When I was a kid, I had the worst problem with cussing ever. I worked in the oil field when I was in high school, and I worked on rigs. And I was the worst cusser on the face of the planet. I was. I mean, and that was one of the hardest habits I ever had to break in my life, was cussing. I just, you know, and that was just, and it was a terrible thing. And when I got older, me and Susie started dating, and came out of high school, and I started trying to control that and not to. That was the hardest thing. But you know, I'm going to tell you, every once in a while, I still cuss inside my brain. You know, I mean, it might not come out of my mouth, but you know, it's still in there. You know. And I think that's the problem, you know, our thoughts. It's so hard for us to control our internals, you know, and I think Jesus was really big on that. Jesus wanted us to look the same in and out, if that makes any sense. And that's difficult, isn't it? I don't know, maybe most y'all, maybe you don't struggle with that in your life, but, you know, most everything that manifests itself within our life, it starts internally. You would agree with that, right? It starts with our thoughts, with our desires, with our lusts, with our emotions. And so for us to be able to control that to an extent is really, really important in the Bible. And I don't think, I really don't know that we can 100% do it. I don't know that I can. Maybe some people can. People spend lifetimes trying to control their inner being. I mean, you look at a lot of the more philosophical type religions, Buddhism and things like that. They spend a tremendous amount of time meditating, trying to control what's inside of them, control their thoughts, control their emotions, control their, you know, they do that because they know, and they have a philosophy that if they could control their inner being, have peace inside of them, that will transcend. That will have peace outside of them. And there's a logic to that thought. I mean, it's not an illogical thought. But they spend years trying to master that. Even monks in monasteries, vows of silence. I mean, you name it. Throughout the centuries, throughout time, man has really tried to master his inner being. And that's very difficult. And yet Jesus desires for us to do this. But I think there's tricks to it. And I think that, you know, Jesus alludes to this, or the Bible alludes to that. Jesus says two different things here. One is, one thing he says is about the cup, washing the inside of the cup. First clean the inside of the dish, and the outside may become clean also. That was kind of a oral law, and the Pharisees were big on cleanliness, washing your hands before you eat. That Jesus was criticized for that. The idea that, and it's not that they didn't wash the inside of the cup. That wasn't Jesus. That really wasn't what Jesus was saying here. But he was making an illustration. And then he talks about whitewashed tombs. And in that society, and of course we have grave markers too, I understand that, but Death isn't to us what it was to Judaism. You know, they whitewashed tombs so you wouldn't accidentally touch them or run into them, because to do that as a Jew made you unclean, ceremonially unclean, and you had to go through a ritual to become clean again. So coming in contact with a tomb or a dead body in Judaism was kind of a problem. So they made sure you could see them, you know, made sure that you knew they were a tomb. But once again, Jesus uses this as an illustration that they look good on the outside, but inside they're not. And then Jesus in 28 summarizes that. You outwardly appear righteous, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness, Jesus accused them of, which is really big, because he's not just saying you're a hypocrite, that you're different on the inside and the outside, but he also said you're full of lawlessness. That's a big thing for them to say that, because they were very adherent to the law. But he says inside you're full of lawlessness. In other words, you're not following the law on the inside of your being, on who you are inwardly. I think there's things in our life that help us with this inside-outside situation. And I think a lot of it is, a lot of our inside depends on our outside, if that makes any sense. Things we expose ourselves to on a daily basis, things that we see, being around bad influences, we might say, whether that be people or whether that be things within our lives, those influence what we dwell on inwardly, the things that we focus on. So we can help ourselves with this problem. But I think it is a problem, and I believe that all of us are hypocrites to an extent. I think that's true. We have children especially. You know, we tell our children to do things, and they're like, "Well, you don't do that," you know, right? Children are kind of that barometer sometimes in our lives. You know, that how we act, what we do, the things that we are. But Jesus does want us to be, and God desires for us to be true through and through, if you want to look at it that way. The same on the inside we are on the outside. He doesn't desire us to be hypocritical in our thoughts, in our actions, in our judgments. Bible speaks repeatedly, as you know, about this idea, repeatedly speaks about this idea. The log in your eye, the splinter in your brother's eye. Repeatedly the Bible speaks about looking at ourselves. Righteousness that comes from God, not self-righteousness, not comparing ourselves to other people. All those things are part of that, are part of this, that make us the person that God wants us to be. Righteous in God's eyes, not in man's eyes, not in our own eyes. The scribes and Pharisees were worried about the outside, what they looked like, but inside they had devious motives. And that's a lot of what Jesus talks about. Any comments about that? You know, the Jews were really big about killing the prophets of God. That was something that happened repeatedly in the Old Testament. This is kind of a confusing passage, because the people that Jesus uses in this illustration, it's kind of hard to nail down who they actually are. They celebrated them in their death. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all these prophets. But in their life, they caused them great pain because they didn't want to hear what they had to say. Jesus accuses them generationally of sin. That is a very difficult thing to understand. Jesus accuses them generationally. He says, you're guilty of what your forefathers did. That's a really big thing. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that the individual is guilty, or the race of Judaism is guilty of it, do you think? It's a generational sin. Jesus does that in the Old Testament, right? He says in Exodus, where he says, won't leave the guilty unpunished, but the third and fourth generations. What does that mean, do you think? But then the Bible also, Old Testament also says, right, the one who sins is the guilty one, right? That you won't, the father won't set the children's teeth on edge. You remember that? The Bible says. In other words, what the father does won't cause grief to the child. But then on the other hand, it says it's generational, right? Third and fourth generation. And here he says they're guilty of killing these prophets, right? You testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How will you escape the sentence of hell? That's pretty strong wording, isn't it? Actually heard a guy call an IRS agent use this very scripture against an IRS agent one time. A serpent and brood of vipers. It's quite an interesting time in my life, actually. Interesting. Anyway, what do you make of that? Well, there was an old law to new law transition for sure, but are they guilty of what their fathers did here? Why do you think they're guilty of what their fathers did? I mean, they didn't do it. Sin carried forward then, went forward into the... No, they didn't have grace, didn't have mercy, didn't have Jesus, didn't have... Yeah, go ahead. Repeated behavior, right? I agree with that. Repeated behavior. They're no different than their fathers. Is that what Jesus is saying? You're basically no different than your fathers. They were Jews, right? You're no different than your fathers. You had the same mentality, same thought process. You know, you're going to kill me, right? Jesus was the ultimate prophet. He was that prophet. They're going to kill Jesus. They're going to kill the apostles. They're going to do this again. This isn't the mentality, the patterns established in Judaism. The pattern is established. They're going to continue to do this. You're the sons of murder. You're going to do the same thing. You're no different than they were. There's no change in this. You're of the same mindset, you see. When Jesus talks about sin going forward, the idea of third and fourth generational sin, the idea that in the Old Testament's huge on that. Why is that such a big thing in the Old Testament? We don't talk about that as Christians. We totally understand that sin is our deal, and that I don't inherit the sin of my parents, and I'm not going to inherit their righteousness either. It's my decision. I'm the one that's going to do it. But in Judaism, this idea of carrying forward was a big idea, right? Why do you think that was? Why do you think that's true? Why do you think we don't think of it that way? We don't think of generational sin. We don't really deal with that idea of generational sin. But we do deal with it. I mean, you might not think we do, but we do, because all of mankind is under the sin of who? Sin of Adam, right? Why? Why are we under the sin of Adam? What's our price for that sin? Death, right? We're carrying his curse, right? If you want to look at it that way, we all carry the curse of Adam. We're all going to die. We're all going to make our living by the sweat of the brow. Women are going to have pain in childbirth, right? We'll all carry that sin of Adam, curse of Adam, if you want to look at it that way. But in the Bible, it was really generational. Who sinned, this man or his parents? God said in Exodus, I'll carry that sin to the third and fourth generations. What is that? What do you think that means? What's the price of sin? Death? That's an easy answer. Do you think there's a price for sin? Do you think there's a price for sin in the world? Do you think you pay a price for sin in this world? Consequences of sin. Do you think that the consequences of your sin can carry on to your children? Not the price of sin, but the consequence of sin. Do you think if you have a sinful life that your children can pay a price in this life for your actions? Right. Right. Not by guilt, not by you're going to go to hell for it, not what I'm talking about. But there's a consequence of sin, I think, in a life, in people's lives. And I think God wants us to look beyond our earthly existence, not just in the way of eternity, but I think the Bible, or God throughout history, has wanted us to look at the idea of the influence of our life on our family, on the people around us. We talk about generational sin. It exists in this world today, I promise you. Not in the fact that God's going to hold them accountable or punish them in hell for something that their parents did. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying everybody in this room knows that we have families that are continually affected because of parents who made terrible, sinful decisions, and their kids paid a price. And a lot of times their children paid a price beyond that, because a lot of times the life that they lived influenced their children to live a life that they lived, which in turn influenced. You understand what I'm saying? Sin is generational. You know, we don't like to talk about that, and I'm not saying that it's something that, like I said, I don't believe there's an eternal consequence. I don't think my sin can condemn my child. Don't get me wrong on that. I don't believe that whatsoever. But I do believe that sin in a life can influence generationally, generations to come. I believe that. I think that's true. You know, there is a generational influence to sin. We see it. We see it in our society, don't we? You know, a child that's abused, that's sexually abused, a child that's sexually abused, chances are they're going to be affected by that for the rest of their life, and there's a good chance that's going to carry on even into their children if they have children. You know, a child that is raised homeless, that's not fed properly, that's not taken care of, a child that relies upon assistance. We see that generationally. That can continue on, right, forever, for a long, long time, until somebody in that family breaks the cycle of it and changes how they do and becomes something different than what they were raised to be. And we know that can happen too, right? I mean, we're not saying that can't happen. But I believe there's a consequence of sin, and I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. I've often thought it's easy to criticize people in the Bible that do bad things, but if we were in their same situation, I'm not sure we would be a lot different. I mean, that's the reality of it. I mean, Jeremiah, let's take the prophet Jeremiah, for instance. You know, Jeremiah was a captivity prophet. He was a prophet during the Babylonian conquest of Israel. He started before it, and he went through it and existed after it. He went through that Babylonian captivity. He began with Jeremiah, right? Which Jeremiah was a book of warning. This is going to end badly for you. If you don't know the story of this, the Babylonians in Israel had a sordid history. But Israel had existed under the Babylonian rule and had paid tribute to them. But eventually the king of Judah, because there's no Israel at this point, we're just talking about Judah. Israel's already been carried off by the Assyrians 100 years ago. So there's no Israel anymore, just talking about Judah. The king of Judah decides, oh, guess what? I'm not going to pay those Babylonians anymore. We're Israel, we're God's people. We're not going to submit to this anymore. We're not going to pay him anymore. And he thought, well, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt is going to come up, swoop up here and help us against the Babylonians. Well, guess what? Egypt never showed up. And Babylonians captured Judah. Jeremiah wasn't an unreasonable man. Jeremiah was God's spokesman. Jeremiah told the king of Judah, he says, don't be an idiot. This is very paraphrased, okay? This is extremely paraphrased. He told the king of Judah, he says, don't be an idiot, pay him, you know? Pay this Babylonian, don't be an idiot. And the king of Judah said, well, I'm tired of listening to you, Jeremiah, to your doom and gloom. So he took Jeremiah and threw him in these caves underneath Jerusalem, and he ripped up his prophecy, tore it up, burned it. And because he didn't want to listen to what Jeremiah had to say, because Jeremiah was a gloom and doom. So eventually Jeremiah gets out. Jeremiah rewrites the prophecy. Guess what? Babylon swoops down, wipes out Judah, carries everybody off. Then Jeremiah is in the grottos of Jerusalem, in the slums, what's left of the destroyed Jerusalem, and Jeremiah writes Lamentations, which now we just call Lamentations. We used to call it the Lamentations of Jeremiah, but we won't call it that anymore. New Bibles, it's just Lamentations. But Jeremiah writes Lamentations because he's lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem. And then poor old Jeremiah, he winds up going to Egypt and dying in Egypt because he basically doesn't have a home. And they killed him. They wanted to kill him. Why? Because they didn't want to hear what he had to say. They did that over and over to prophets in the Old Testament. They didn't listen to him. They tried to destroy him. Look at poor old Elijah, right? Look at Elijah. He did all that, destroyed all them prophets and all that, and what did they do? Jezebel and Ahab, they wanted to kill him, right? They're going to kill him, going to wipe him off the face of the earth. And poor Elijah, he's running to keep from being destroyed. That's who these people were. But I asked myself, if I had been a Jew in the days of Jeremiah, would I have listened to Jeremiah? Or would I have wanted to get him out of my sight and not pay any attention to what he had to say and get rid of him? I don't know. Jennifer said it kind of, we're kind of the same people over and over and over. We never really change. We're kind of the same people. We kind of respond in the same way. I think that comes out a lot of that generation. And so that's what Jesus is saying in 30. If you had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners in them in shedding the blood of the prophets. But then Jesus says, so you testify against yourselves as your sons of those who murdered them. You see? Jesus is saying you're the sons of those who murdered the prophets. And then he says, fill up the measure of guilt. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? In other words, you're no different. You're no different than your fathers. You're your father's children. You're no different. Because you're going to do what Jesus is looking at here. You're going to do exactly the same things they did. You're going to kill me. You see? You're your father's children. You haven't changed. You say you've changed, that now you'll listen, but you haven't changed at all. You speak against yourselves. Yeah. Yeah. Well, people never want to hear what they need to hear. Well, none of us do. We want to hear what we want to hear. Everybody in here. That's what we want. But we know, hopefully, we're mature enough to know that sometimes we need to hear things, even if we might not want to hear them, right? So then Jesus, he explains it. I'm sending you prophets, wise men, scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. From Abel, right, to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah. You see, that's a little problem there, because we don't know what Zechariah Jesus is talking about, because we don't know that Zechariah, one of the last prophets of the Old Testament, the prophet Zechariah, we're not sure if he was actually murdered or martyred or not. So there's a lot of discussion about that, but I don't know the good answer. But the idea, most people say Jesus was trying to go from the very beginning to the very end of the Old Testament, Abel to Zechariah, whom he murdered between the temple and the altar. And I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So this generation, you're the ones that's going to pay. You're the ones that are going to do this. Your generation. All this is going to come on you. The end of the law, the end of the Old Testament. All this stuff is coming upon you. All this guilt, all this bloodshed from the beginning to the end, because you're a product of all that stuff that went on before. You're a product of all that stuff that happened. And then Jesus laments. Yeah. Right. It's a huge thing. I was telling, I can't remember who I was telling, it might have been Gary, but I was telling somebody, that, I can't imagine, maybe it was Brent I was talking to. Yeah, I said, can you imagine being a scribe and Pharisee in that conversation? I mean, in that crowd? That's just as, he called them everything, right? I can't even imagine. You can't imagine why they wouldn't want to kill him after this. They would want to kill you after this. And the only reason I can see they didn't was probably because of the crowds that were around Jesus. They probably knew they couldn't get away with it. But to have to sit and listen to that, that's like getting called to the principal's office and being told to be quiet while the principal tells you everything you ever did wrong. That's hard to even fathom. This was cruel. Can I use that word? It was blunt. Yeah, there's no way you're going to miss it. This is absolutely straightforward as you can possibly be. And I can't just imagine the scribes and Pharisees in there by this point in this conversation, by this point in this discourse, they're so mad, I don't even know they're listening anymore. You know what I'm saying? They're about as mad as they're going to get. Yeah. I think that's what it leads up to, and that's what he's leading up to in this whole discourse, is that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. Basically Judaism is going to pay the price for their insubordination for centuries. Really. They were always insubordinate, weren't they, pretty much? And I think the destruction of Jerusalem is, I'm like you, Gary. I think this whole thing, he's leading up to this throughout this whole thing that, I'm going to destroy you as a people. Basically your guilt is beyond forgiveness, more or less, right? There's no way out for you here. You've kind of drove the nail in your own coffin, right? There we go. It's one of them old sayings, right? Drove the nail in your own coffin. It is, for sure. Bible's very racist. There's no two ways about it. Judaism is very racist. Was very racist. Yeah, it's the same thing going on today over there, right? Sure. Yeah, it's, I always think of Titus, when he talks about Cretans are always liars, or always, remember that? I always think about that verse Paul wrote over there, Cretans are always gluttonous liars, or whatever he calls them. All Cretans are gluttonous, I always think of that verse, There's definitely some racism in the Bible. There's no doubt about it. But, it is. And as a race, Jews as a race, he's calling them to account. And I don't think as individuals he's doing it, because I know there's individuals in Judaism that are going to convert to Christianity, that are going to become Christians. I think there's a way out individually. I think there's a way out for them. But as a race, it's done, As a race, it's over. And this is his lament. I don't think I've ever lamented in my life. Laments are big in the Bible. People lament in the Bible. I don't know that I've ever lamented. I don't know that I know how to do that, actually. Maybe in my own way, I guess. I'm not near as good at it as they are, though. They know how to do it. They know how to lament, right? Yeah, it was this, I can just see it, tearing the clothes and wailing, and I see that down in New Orleans at them funerals. Them people can lament, right? But I don't know that we're a real lamenting people. But Jesus laments, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. Wouldn't you like to have heard Jesus say this? I just would like to hear the intonation and was he like wailing when he said this? Was he crying out? I don't know. But I would love to hear Jesus say this, because I know it had to have been powerful. Because I think laments in the Bible are just really powerful. And I don't think you can just read it and get it. But I think if we could have heard it, even if we didn't understand whatever Jesus said this in, Aramaic or Greek, probably Aramaic, I think we could hear the passion of it, the intonation of it. But we can't really get it reading it. But it's a lament. Who kills the prophet, stones those. How often, right? I wanted your children together. How often I wanted to gather them together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling, Jesus says. And then the great condemnation, right? Your house is being left desolate. You ever thought about what that means? What house? Huh? Temple. Why is it being left desolate? What does it mean for something to be desolate? If a house is desolate, it's what? Huh? Unoccupied, uninhabited. You see what he tells them? Your house is being left unoccupied. Who occupied the temple? God. I mean, this is astronomical. This says God's not there anymore, right? God's left. Elvis has left the building, right? God has left the building, right? He's not here anymore. And it's huge when he says that. Your house, your temple, he says, I say to you, from now on you will not see me. Do you understand what do you catch this? Your house is being left desolate. God's not there. You will not see me. Do you get what's going on here? You will not see me. I'm God, right? Until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a huge statement. And at the end of everything he's just told them, and then to say, I'm leaving. I mean, that's and this is why. He just told them why he was leaving, didn't he? He just told them why he was leaving. And now he's walking out the door. I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm divorcing you. This is one of them Dear John letters left on the door of the house, you know. I mean, he says, I'm done with you. This is why I'm done with you, and I'm leaving, and you're not going to see me again until you probably don't want to see me again, right? And that brings us to chapter 24. Now we've set the stage, right? Jesus has criticized them. He's told them everything they've done wrong. Told them how bad they are. Told them that they're not worth anything. Told them that they're going to go to hell, right? And now he says, now he's going away. He set the stage for what he's going to say right here. He just said, I'm leaving. Now he goes away. And he gets up on this mount and he looks at these buildings, this temple, which had to be magnificent. This thing had been going on for like 30 or 40 years before. Herod started doing this in like 30 BC. And it wasn't done. When Jesus was here, the temple still wasn't finished. The temple will not be finished until like 40-something AD. It's not even done yet. They're still working on it. This is a huge project because the temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then Ezra comes back and rebuilds the temple. But it's nothing like Solomon's temple, not even close. And so when Herod comes along, Herod the Great, to appease the Jews, not because he really cared about them, but to appease the Jews, he is going to reconstruct this temple. And so it's a massive project. And they're very proud of it, as anybody would be. So Jesus is looking down on it. Not even finished. People are still working on it. And Jesus says, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. That's a fact that will occur. Because in 71 AD, the Romans are going to destroy the temple, destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and they're going to utterly tear down every stone of that temple, pry it apart. Because the way I understand it is that the stones of the temple, there was no mortar. They were just hewn flat and placed together. And that when the temple was melted, was burned, which Titus told them not to burn it, but they burned it anyway. And when they burned it, the gold and stuff ran down into those stones, and they pried them apart to get it out. And literally, what's true is true. There's nothing left. The temple in Jerusalem is underneath the Temple Mount, which is where the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim mosque, is today. And the Wailing Wall that you see, that people go to, that you see on TV, is not part of the temple. It's actually just a retaining wall that Herod built to hold back the earth to support the temple that he built. So the temple itself is underneath mountains of dirt in the bottom, underneath this Muslim mosque. And the Jews are wailing at this, basically this retaining wall where they wail, which is really the only part of that that's left, utterly destroyed, just as Jesus said it would be. So we'll start getting into Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is a really, really difficult passage, and we got to look at a lot of Old Testament scripture. We're not going to get into that this morning, but we will look at it next class. Thanks for your time.